Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarayan Mukherjee, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you this evening Ashley Dawson, who is Professor of Postcolonial Studies in the English Department of the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and the College of Staten Island. His latest books include People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons, Extreme Cities, The Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Change, and Extinction, A Radical History. He is a member of the Social Text Collective and the founder of the CUNY Climate Action Lab and a longtime climate justice activist. He is currently at work on a book entitled Environmentalism from Below, and with the Environmental Humanities Lab in Stockholm on the creation of a global network of organizations devoted to people's planning for radical climate action. I'm sure all of you will appreciate how Professor Dawson's scholarly activist work is so very important, but by way of introduction, I want to underscore one aspect of why this is so. His scholarly engagement with environmental sustainability, energy transition, and the climate crisis brings into the foreground the complex problems posed by runaway social inequality, by his persistent historical injustices, and class power as this is racialized and gendered. In this regard, I want to read to you one very brief passage from his book, People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons, a book many of you will know and which I cannot recommend highly enough should you not have read it yet. Professor Dawson writes, if our collective future is presently being determined by a small cabal of fossil oligarchs, who are making money while driving the planet toward biological annihilation, the alternative to such folly is to collectivize the control of energy and to organize a just transition to renewable power through participatory democratic control. In order to make this power shift, we need to stop thinking of energy as a commodity and instead conceive of it as part of the global commons, a vital element in the great stock of air, water, plants, and collectively created cultural forms like music and language that should be regarded as the inheritance of humanity as a whole. In arguing this, Professor Dawson concentrates our attention on two sets of very complex and challenging problems. The first are the questions and problems of truly democratic economic planning on a planetary scale, without which our societies and ecologies will continue their toxic march into deeper and more destructive crises, and regeneration and sustainability will remain out of reach. The second have to do with transformations of lifestyles, practices, desires, relationships, and laws, without which interlocking oppressions and environmental injustices of colonialism and patriarchy that are integral to a capitalist global system will continue to undermine the efforts of human collectivities to alter the fates that now await us. These issues surely lie at the heart of sustainability research at this moment, deep into a pandemic, the devastating consequences of which will remain with us for a long time yet. While we in Canada continue to fall far behind the rest of the world by letting ourselves be sidetracked by Sasquatch cartoons, the US, with its global reach, is now a site of both great possibilities, but also very great problems. To help us think them through, Professor Dawson will be speaking tonight for 35 minutes or so, after which we will have a good bit of time for a Q&A session. Professor Dawson's lecture is titled Green Capitalist Realism, CO2lonialism, and the Urban Climate Insurgency. I now pass the Zoom over to you, Professor Dawson.
Thank you so much, Sarayan. I really appreciate your very generous introduction. And I also want to thank Sheena Wilson and Natalie Lovelace for the invitation to speak here. It's a real honor to be with you all. And I also want to thank Allison and the rest of the team for making things possible tonight. Okay, so let me share my screen with you all and start my PowerPoint presentation. All right, here we are. So this is my presentation, 4 different parts. Part 1, Green Capitalist Realism. Part 2, Colonialism and Eco-Modernism. part 3, energy transition, and then part 4, the urban climate insurgency. The main takeaways, I think the climate emergency is undeniably intensifying around the world, but we still live in a political and ideological interregnum. The multitudes are on the move, but they do not always express their struggles in environmental terms. And engaged scholars can, at times, in the best of times, help articulate intersectional struggles in terms of climate justice. Okay, so part 1, green capitalist realism. So it's official, the UN reports a staggering rise in climate emergencies in the last 20 years. Shouldn't be news, but there are studies out there showing that this is happening. 2020 set a new record in terms of disasters. And this is a map produced by the National Atmospheric and Oceanographic Institute in the United States, just giving you a bit of a sense of some of these disasters. They include heat waves, hurricanes, tornadoes, and wildfires, but you should note that this does not include the pandemic, which could also be seen in some ways as a climate catastrophe. And all of this is coming in the teeth of a temporary lull in carbon emissions. But of course, cumulative carbon levels have continued to increase, and the rate of emissions is increasing once again now as we come out of the pandemic. All of this gives folks a sense that we are living in a new situation of what Kai Heron calls capitalist catastrophism. For Heron, this situation is one in which disaster capitalism is permanent, not, as Naomi Klein argues in This Changes Everything, an anomalous interlude that capitalists used to seize more power over the economy before things return to quote unquote normal. In these conditions, Heron argues capitalism can no longer determine what it means to be quote unquote realistic, not because of the force of movements assembled against it, but because of capital's self-undermining and ecologically destructive dynamics, which have outstripped capitalism's powers to control them. I think this is a very interesting analysis, and I encourage you to take a look at Heron's article. But I also think we need to think carefully about how a crisis plays out and what the kind of history of crisis is. And so it's useful to think about the work of the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci in theorizing the history of crisis. Of course, he was writing in the 1930s during another huge moment of crisis in the history of capitalism. And he argued that a crisis is a kind of condensation of multiple underlying societal contradictions that move history from one historical phase or conjuncture to the next, and that the unfolding of crisis has a kind of productive aspect that pushes the boundaries of the existing order, since every crisis is also a moment of reconstruction. So they're kind of mixed affairs, and they don't necessarily mean a sharp break where you go from one order to the other in some immediate fashion. Gramsci also talked about different modes of crisis, right? He talked about a conjunctural crisis, which appears in daily political life and is not a kind of systemic changing event. And then Gramsci also talked about organic crises, which do rattle the very foundations and shift the foundations on which social orders are built. Gramsci argued that these organic crises produce morbid symptoms that disrupt everyday political and economic life, and in the long run, destroy old societal orders and power relations. For Gramsci, the organic crisis is rooted in an alienation of the masses from political representation. And during the kind of period of the organic crisis, which Gramsci called an interregnum, the mummified and anachronistic actors of the past are not able to solve the crisis within the framework of the dying order. And this leads to a kind of crisis of authority that leaves an ideological void and thus the possibility for different crisis solutions. So I would suggest that we are in one of these moments of interregnum, one filled with morbid symptoms as well as mummified and anachronistic actors. And consequently, there's a crisis of authority. And this crisis has been playing out for a while. Obviously, the economic crisis that started in 2008 hasn't been resolved and had a lot to do with the rise of right-wing populist figures like Donald Trump and the many other similar figures around the world. But it also has to do with the moment we find ourselves in right now. a moment where there's an effort to reconstruct a kind of hegemonic arrangement by elites, and in doing that to really cope with the climate emergency. So we're on the cusp of a kind of an unfolding of a massive new infrastructure plan from the Biden administration. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, but we can look backward to some of Biden's promises while he was running for office to get a sense of what the package that is soon to be released to the public and to Congress will look like. So what were some of the key components of the Biden climate plan? Well, one of them was a forthright statement of the climate threat, which of course was really great, given the fact that Donald Trump and his regime had been climate change deniers of the most grave ilk. Then, of course, there's also a promise that the US will shift to clean power and green infrastructure. Biden promises will eliminate greenhouse gas emissions in the power sector by 2035 and achieve a 100% clean energy economy and net zero emissions no later than 2050. And of course, the kind of Green New Deal element of all of this is that millions and millions of well-paying jobs will be created. Now, all of this is obviously extremely positive. It's a product of the fights of social movements on the ground to force elites into changing their policies. But it's certainly not an unadulterated victory. And if we look at some of the problems with what Biden has said in the past he's going to do, we can see how some of his likely soon to be announced plans might fall short. For example, the 2050 timeline is far too slow, given what we know from climate science, and the enforcement mechanisms that Biden has promised are quite vague. So, you know, it's easy to sort of say you'll do something by 2050. It's essentially sort of punting the ball down the field. In addition, what Biden describes as the clean energy economy is sometimes defined in his proposals to include technologies like nuclear energy, which at the moment is not economically competitive with renewable power. So this is essentially a kind of political gambit, as well as carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, which is sometimes touted as clean coal. In other words, you know, something put into place by the fossil fuel industry. In addition, there's another element of Biden's plans that I find particularly troubling. This is that they're kind of based on a framework of inter-imperial competition. So here are a few quick quotations from the Biden plans that were announced when he was running for office. Right? They include these promises that America, United States, has a great opportunity to lead in the industries of the future. Lots of saber rattling against China, saying that China will not game the system. And also talking about how the US is going to become the world's clean energy superpower, and then it will be able to export a lot of the newly developed energy technology. And you'll see in the course of my presentation why I object to some of these issues, but just to give you one quite clear sense of this, here's a chart or bar graph that gives you some idea of the historic responsibility of the United States for carbon emissions, cumulative carbon emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And this comes from Carbon Brief. You can go on the website and it actually goes year by year, starting in about 1800 all the way up to 2018. And you can see who has the most responsibility at any particular historical moment. If we freeze this in 2018 at the end of their historical span, of course, we see that China bears the second most weighty responsibility. However, that is a somewhat disingenuous feature of this chart, or a deceptive feature of the chart, because of course, a great deal of China's carbon emissions come from the manufacture of products for US markets. Here's another chart from another website that gives you a bit of a sense of the historic responsibilities for carbon emissions. So, you know, when we talk about who bears responsibilities and what should be happening in terms of a Green New Deal, I think we need to think about these historical responsibilities and what kinds of reparations the United States might need to put on the table, given its historic responsibility for colonizing the atmosphere with its emissions, rather than thinking about how US technologies are going to propel it to an even stronger position in some inter-imperial competition. But I think that the reason that we see this kind of element of inter-imperial competition and rhetoric in Biden's climate plan is because of the fact that the existing outlook has not shifted. In other words, despite the fact that we're in this kind of crisis conjuncture, what I talked about when I was describing Gramsci's analysis of the organic crisis, it's still very difficult to imagine the end of capitalism. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism, Mark Fisher wrote. And he was talking about the film Children of Men, as well as this phrase attributed to Jameson and Slavoj Žižek. And he used it to define what he termed capitalist realism, the sense that capitalism is the only viable political and economic system, and it's impossible to imagine a coherent alternative to it. And I think that we are not entirely out of that situation. In fact, I would argue that what we're looking at with the Biden plan, which again is something that's a product of a great deal of struggle by social movements, but nonetheless, you know, it's trying to make sure that we get to continue and elites get to continue living in the state of affairs that has defined the American way of life, right? So my idea of green capitalist realism is it's a widespread sense that a convenient technological solution will fix the climate crisis, precluding the need for any significant economic or cultural shifts, and protecting a way of life embodied in US cities. So it's a kind of dominant ideology for a new regime of capital accumulation. Morbid symptoms of the current interregnum will continue to stack up, however, producing an enduring political crisis. So what I'm going to be tracking in the rest of this presentation is the ways in which green capitalist realism is an effort to cobble together a new kind of hegemonic arrangement that acknowledges the climate crisis, but is really not commensurate with solving that crisis. And of course, it's clear that Biden is not thinking about dismantling capitalism or imperialism most clearly, and that this is why morbid symptoms are going to continue to stack up. So part 2, colonialism and eco-modernism. By way of an example of some of the kind of morbid symptoms and compromise formations that I want to suggest characterize green capitalist realism, I would point to the announcement by General Motors shortly after Biden was inaugurated, and it became clear that a new Green Deal was going to be in the cards, that it was shifting to selling zero-emission vehicles by 2035. And in an article in the New York Times, a kind of paper of record in the United States, you'll note that the coverage featured a GM Hummer, which, like so many cars, is marketed through its insertion in a kind of rugged natural landscape. So this idea of sort of technology dominating the natural world, which has defined European settler colonial thought since the 18th century. And of course, the Hummer has a kind of iconography that goes beyond just this sort of idea of domination of nature. The Hummer is, of course, the emblem of US empire and toxic masculinity. It was developed by the US military and deployed to Iraq during the war of the United States there. So it's no accident that it gets deployed here, I think. And it suggests that there's not too much thought on the part of elites and New York Times journalists about the implications of the kind of compromise moment and crisis-ridden moment that we're in. And the elements of crisis and the kind of morbid symptoms of the current moment become clear if one starts thinking just a little bit about commodity flows involved in switching to electric vehicles, right? So electric vehicles, aside from the fact that they have to be charged with electricity, which often comes from fossil fuels at this point, and consequently is more greenhouse gas emissions producing than just plain old gasoline. In addition to that, electric vehicles and the batteries that are inside them, the large batteries inside them, take a great deal of material to produce. And so you can see some of that on this chart, what it might look like in terms of a 100% electric vehicle world. The amount of increased lithium, cobalt, and other rare earth minerals we need. And then to think about that, how that would play out on a historic timeline, this chart is interesting because it gives you a sense that there are also temporal limits to how much we can exploit the Earth to get these kinds of resources and get access to these kinds of resources. That doesn't stop folks like the eco-modernists from praising the intensification of energy and resources that is playing out at the present moment. So the Eco-Modernist Manifesto was produced by the Breakthrough Institute, which is based in California and argues that the environmentalist emphasis on limits is part of a stale discourse left over from the 1970s when the famous Limits to Growth report was produced. As I said, Breakthrough is based in California, and it's animated by many of the same myths about limitless clean growth that emerged from big tech in the United States. But I'm just going to give you a few quotations from the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. They argue for a good Anthropocene that involves using social, economic, and technological powers to make life better for people, to stabilize the climate and protect the natural world. They argue for intensifying human activities like energy extraction, forestry, and settlement, in other words, urbanization, to use less land and to decouple human development from environmental impacts. And they talk about socioeconomic and technological processes that are leading to economic modernization and environmental protection. These kinds of arguments have been picked up in many other places. For instance, MIT technologist Andrew McAfee's best-selling More from Less book champions the idea of dematerialization. He argues that we can continue to grow global GDP indefinitely while reducing our ecological impact. And he justifies this by saying that US consumption of resources have remained steady or even declined since the 1980s, all while gross domestic product has risen dramatically. But as the anthropologist Jason Hickel has pointed out, this celebration of green growth is based on an accounting error. That is, McAfee only looks at data on domestic consumption. He includes domestic consumption, but not the resources involved in extracting, producing, and transporting all the goods consumed. And because, as I said a little bit earlier, when I was talking about historic cumulative carbon emissions, the US and other rich nations have offshored production to poorer nations, including China, over the last 40 years. So what we essentially have is a kind of accounting trick where the resource use involved in producing goods for US consumption are taken off the books. In fact, if we look at metrics that include all of that resource use, like this chart of raw material consumption, we can see that increasing GDP and raw material consumption actually track fairly closely to one another. And when we looked on a world scale, we can see that world raw material consumption is accelerating massively, including in recent years. And all of this extraction, production, consumption, and wastage is driven by massive increases in energy production and carbon emissions. What solutions are being proposed for this evident problem? Well, one of them is recycling, like cobalt and lithium recycling, which, as you can see from this chart, will make somewhat of a difference, but will certainly not change or cancel the fact that a massive build out of electric vehicles and other forms of solar power is also going to mean massively increased forms of extraction. Another proposal coming from the socialist writer Aram Bastani, his book is called Fully Automated Luxury Communism, is mining the sky. Bastani says, well, you know, capitalists like Elon Musk are planning to go into mining space, so we just need to basically socialize it and put it under social democratic control. This scheme sounds completely harebrained to me, given the fact that we're ruining the planet with the existing forms of consumption of minerals and with energy consumption. And, you know, I think if we look back down on the Earth, what we see is the ways in which increasing inter-imperial competition is already beginning to play out around access to many of the raw materials necessary for the transition to renewable energy. Here's a chart of where many of these precious minerals are located. And we can already see not only sort of moves on financial markets about gaining access or hoarding these materials, but also geopolitical rivalry heating up around them. And one of the clearest instances has to do with Elon Musk's confession to a lithium coup against Evo Morales and the MAS government in Bolivia a year or so ago. It's not clear whether or not Musk was involved in the coup. The United States certainly was. And of course, MAS has come back to power now as a result of really massive social mobilization. But the sheer fact that people are talking about this makes the kind of future of warfare around resources pretty clear. And I can talk about some of the details around social movements in Bolivia in the question and answer if people would like. And, you know, we're also, of course, already seeing massive human rights violations linked to the extraction of mineral resources, which are part of quotidian reality for us in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. What kinds of alternative pathways are there that do not involve taking existing resource flows and consumption for granted? This is part 3, where I'll talk a little bit about people's power. Okay, it's important to note that renewable energy is an increasing source of energy for people, but that it's on top of existing forms of energy, including petroleum and natural gas, and even coal in this projection by the International Energy Association. It's clear that we're sort of stuck with business as usual on a global scale. I want to take us to a completely different scale, to the scale of New York City, where I'm based and where I've been involved in activist campaigns and able to follow struggles for change during the last 4 years, when, of course, it's been absolutely impossible to make any kind of progressive change on a national scale. So New York City decided to divest from fossil fuels. One of the big victories. It also passed a groundbreaking emissions law that put a cap on emissions for large buildings in the future, but the real estate lobby is fighting against this tooth and nail. And it's also worth noting that the United States, New York City gets a significant component of its energy from fossil fuels, about 67% in 2019, and that almost 25% of it comes from nuclear power. That's, you know, supposedly renewable energy, but or clean energy, but that nuclear power is being phased out over the next 2 years. And so, in fact, what we're seeing is in New York City is increasing amounts of fossil fuel power in the coming years, according to this projection. And that means more peaker plants, dirty, often oil-burning energy plants located in working-class communities of color in the outer boroughs of New York City. There's a strong fight against these trends heating up. One of the campaigns that I'm involved in is the campaign for public power. This is the website, Public Power NYC, but it's actually a New York statewide campaign. Some of the key components of the campaign are to push for the creation of a new power authority that's not private, not an investor-owned utility like Con Edison, which is the one that we have that provides most power to people in New York City right now. So to make sure that New York Power Authority is going to be generating and transmitting 100% renewable energy to state and municipal-owned properties, and to create a democratically elected board of trustees, right? Not to have them appointed by the governor and other political elites. So these are just a few components of the campaign, which is rolling out bills in the current relatively progressive state legislature. So it's I think a very interesting campaign, and it's looking to other models of energy democracy like the one in the municipalized energy system in Berlin that I write about in People's Power. There are other campaigns on the ground. For instance, the environmental justice organization Uprose is creating a community-based solar power entity and is arguing for a green, renewable industrial district, which would fight gentrification and would also be a place where wind turbines to be placed offshore from the city would be built and assembled. So, we really need to scale up our energy transition plans very quickly, and there are movements fighting for that within existing channels. But there is also a movement fighting on the streets, and that is what I'm going to talk about in the final part of my presentation, the urban climate insurgency. When I say urban climate insurgency, I refer to the ensemble of grassroots initiatives which aim to tackle climate change from a radical point of view and take the city as the primary locus of action in doing so. My use of the term insurgent does not necessarily imply violence, but rather refers to the radical rejection of the current sociological system and socioeconomic system. And I think it's a reaction to the organic crisis that I described in part one. We have multiple different forms of activism going on. When I talk about urban climate insurgency, I certainly don't mean to marginalize rural movements. This is a picture from the Stop Enbridge Line 3 campaign that's going on in Minnesota at the moment, trying to stop tar sands from coming down from Alberta into the United States. And of course, there's mobilization happening in New York City, particularly to attack the big financial interests that are bankrolling Line 3. But I do want to think about the particularity of the urban as a site for climate crisis, both a place that generates crisis, environmental crisis because of massive emissions, but also one that is severely impacted by forms of environmental crisis. So last summer, some comrades and I put together this Hot City blog on the Verso blog, where we tried to highlight the current crisis is a kind of compound crisis in terms that directly linked to what I had to say earlier in the presentation, drawing on Gramsci. My friend Arash Karwazad put together this urban displacement map for New York City, which gives you a sense of the way in which the crisis is a compound one. So he overlaid maps by the Federal Emergency Management Administration that show parts of New York City that are likely to be flooded, with parts of the city where rent is too high for people to avoid, and parts of the city where people are struggling with low incomes, to give you a real sense of displacement in its kind of multiple compound sense. And I think it's important to think of this in terms of the struggle for climate justice that is intersectional. So Ingrid Joylin Paredes, an activist, talks about climate justice in these terms, right? She talks about how Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities in the city are under-resourced, overpolluted, disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. They're heavily brutalized by over-militarized police, and they're also fighting environmental racism. So when activists say, "I can't breathe," that refrain resonates on multiple different levels, right? It's a part of a campaign against state violence and also about the slow violence of climate change. So in the city right now, there's a big activist campaign against the North Brooklyn Fracked gas pipeline. You can see here that the images which the campaign is using, like the snake biting its own tail, very much connect up with the images used in campaigns of indigenous water protectors in other parts of the US. And the language of refusing to be a sacrifice zone is also something that I think that stresses the kind of intersectionality of the climate justice struggle in New York City and stresses the connections that can be forged with activists in other parts of the world. And so I want to suggest that the climate emergency is a kind of political unconscious that's a constitutive feature of all contemporary public events. And that means that even events where a kind of lexicon of climate crisis and environmentalism is not used, nonetheless, I think can be thought of in terms of the climate emergency, right? So let's go to the anti-austerity struggles in Santiago, Chile. And that was the sort of outset slide that I had at the beginning of this section. It was an image from those protests in Santiago, Chile. These are protests against neoliberal austerity, but I would say they're also protests for the right to low carbon mobility, right? So when the regime pushed through a higher price for the subways and other forms of public transit, protesters began this campaign saying evade. And there have been similar campaigns over the last year or so in New York City with the group FTP, Fuck the Police, occupying subways, saying that increasing presence of police in the subways is a form of oppression and needs to be rolled back, since the subways should be free and accessible to everyone. So I think we can see here that abolition is, kind of to take a leaf from Stuart Hall, abolition is a kind of modality of climate justice. And here's some images from the FTP campaign, where you can see the ways in which they were mobilizing in the public transit system and demanding access and abolition. So I want to use this language of articulation from Stuart Hall, where he argued that articulation, this is coming right after that dash, has to be constructed in practice because it is not guaranteed how these forces that could be aligned are constituted, right? So it's an active practice. This goes back to what I said at the outset about how engaged intellectuals have a role to play in helping to forge solidarity and helping to make connections between different struggles. And I think we can see some of that stuff happening in New York City. This is from a campaign to close down the main prison on Rikers Island. And that island is not being, or the campaign so far has won a commitment from the city to shift it into a renewable facility. And just to take one last example, Indian farmers who have been on strike for many months outside Delhi, ostensibly, of course, they're campaigning against the dominant government, the BJP's introduction of neoliberal reforms in the farming sector. But in fact, the urban climate insurgency that they represent is based on the failure of the government to guarantee the means for basic social reproduction. What's happened is that climate change has made farming less and less economically viable, and the government is essentially cutting farmers loose into a free market, which is going to punish them. And so what we see in this campaign, I think, is a sense of outrage on the part of people that the government is unable to guarantee or unwilling to guarantee the basic means of social reproduction. So the kind of organic crisis and revolutionary possibilities that come out of it are likely to intensify around the globe as the climate emergency deepens. And I just want to close with some of the Bali principles of climate justice from 2002. They argued that climate change violates United Nations human rights, that indigenous communities and indigenous peoples and affected communities have a right to speak for themselves, that capitalism is deepening the climate crisis, and they call for climate reparations based on ecological debt. So very different from what we hear in current Green New Deal language, but not all that different from what we hear in a lot of activist campaigns on the ground in places like New York City and in many other places around the world. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I'd love to take questions.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for a very incisive and cogent talk regarding these very urgent issues. There's so many of folks on this call that we're going to have to take questions on the chat. So I'd ask you to please type your question into the chat, and Alison from the council will be gathering them up for us, and I'll read them out for Ashley to address. So that's how we'll do this. There's already a few questions that have come in, so we'll just start with those, Ashley.
Great.
So one of the questions is, have you read Andreas Malm's How to Blow Up a Pipeline? And is there a role for property damage sabotage as a way to slow down the carbon industry?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm actually teaching Malm's book. I'm not surprised it's on all of your minds. I think he raises really important questions. I completely agree with him that we need to challenge the idea of nonviolent direct action as some kind of like universal means for success on the part of the climate campaign, and on the part of climate justice movements. And his arguments were very much in my mind as I thought about the ways in which movements like the one in Chile has unfolded, right? They've been very much involved in property damage, as those images for the campaign, from their campaign really shows. So, I think Malm has an important point. And when he argues that property and the sacrosanct character of property is going to lead to the destruction of the planet, he has a really important point, which we need to think about. Two caveats. So he's very clear that he means damage to property, not damage to human beings. And the other point that I would make is that I think the movements on the ground need to think this through strategically, right? What may work in a social democratic state in the European Union may not work in the United States. I've been part of direct action campaigns in European countries, and the relationship that people have to the police, who in many parts of Europe are not armed, is very, very different from the relationship of indigenous groups or people of African descent in the United States, right? So I think movements have to think these questions through strategically very carefully from where they are located. And whatever we as intellectuals and people in the public sphere are saying, we very much have to take our lead from what the activists who are putting their bodies on the line are saying they want us to say.
Great, thank you. I should have said that question was from Walter. And now we have a question from Christina. What is the promise of the Green New Deal as a framework for pursuing urban climate justice? Are there problems with that framework? You touched upon this, but if there's things you'd want to highlight.
Yeah, thanks. I think of course, one of the great things about the Green New Deal is that it gets away from the idea that the change we need purely has to be about some kind of sacrifice, that it can create lots of jobs. And I know that's very much an issue in Alberta, as it is in many parts of the United States. This is one of the problems we're finding in the campaign for public power in New York City, right? Getting the union of workers in Con Ed on board with our campaign is proving to be quite difficult. In fact, they backed out of this organization, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, when Trade Unions for Energy Democracy said they're not in favor of fracking, right? So, the Green New Deal holds out possibility for really creating new and powerful coalitions in general. I think on urban terrain, the excitement is that it can be quite intersectional again, right? It can bring together struggles around housing justice, transportation justice, and energy transition. And this is particularly important when you think about something like mass transit, right? If we're not just going to shift from internal combustion engine cars to electric vehicles, which seems to be the dominant plan and, is one of the kinds of goals envisaged by the Green New Deal, if instead we're going to really emphasize kind of communal luxury and public transit, we need to make sure that everyone can access public transit. But, what I've found in talking to activists in New York City is that many communities of color are worried about having transit lines extended to their community because it almost automatically leads to gentrification. So, right, we need to have really decent programs of building accessible and affordable housing that is also very low emissions for people, that go in tandem with beefing up public transit and energy transition. And unless we have all three of those things, we're not going to solve the climate crisis, but we're not going to solve the elements of extreme inequality and racism and oppression in our cities as well. So those kinds of solutions need to go hand in hand, and all too often they're not thought of in a connected way. So that's where I would like to sort of push the Green New Deal to think about these things.
There's a couple of other questions on the Green New Deal, so maybe just pursue this a little bit. And one of the things about the Green New Deal, it seems to me, is that it is a kind of political imaginary that's emerging. But as you were suggesting, both in your talk and in your answer now, that within the framework of capitalist realism, it's not possible, right? That the Green New Deal as a kind of political imaginary and a form of politics, and eventually a set of policies would need to go beyond eco-modernist strategies, capitalist realist strategies, and so on, right? So one of the questions that Nilakshi asks is, what three things would you change about the GND so that it does begin to address climate justice issues and so on?
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the Green New Deal needs to not take the current reality for granted, right? And, that means, of course, in kind of big terms, not taking capitalism and the current system of inter-imperial competition for granted. Now, obviously, we need kind of concrete change on the ground. I'm not saying we should wait around until we overthrow capitalism to make any of the changes we need, but whatever changes we kind of are fighting for and kind of pushing elites in power to make, they need to be non-reformist reforms that are going to lead in the kinds of directions we really want. So, the example of the electric vehicle I picked is one example, kind of instance of a reform which sort of takes the existing infrastructures of high consumption and high greenhouse gas emissions sort of for granted, and just imagines greening them and switching them out. And what I'm trying to suggest is that instead we absolutely need to think much more about sort of more low emissions forms of propinquity and connection. And that means changing cities, but also, completely greening suburbs, which are the main place that people live in the United States and one of the main sites for emissions. And it's particularly important because, people are being priced out of central cities, right? So people are being pushed further and further into the peripheral exurbs of cities and having to buy cars and do that kind of commuting. So the kind of change needs to be really holistic, as I said. So I've already pointed to those three different kind of linked things. And then the other element has to involve, I think, dismantling the existing forms of trade agreements, which push countries into accepting regimes of capitalist growth, like the Green Revolution, and sort of high consumption, high fossil fuel production in the agricultural sector. So, all of those fights from back in the 1990s against the WTO, those all have to go on and be intensified. And we have to think about technology transfer to the global South as part of global reparations, right? So, it shouldn't be about increasing competition. It should be about making sure that we're on a path towards some kind of sustainable development. And of course, or that word development is a problem, but it should be as low carbon as possible in all instances.
Great. There's a couple of questions about education that I want to now turn to. Kimberly asks, your research, writing, and teaching is informed by your activism. And yet this kind of work tends not to be valued in higher education institutes. In thinking about the future of education, how should higher education institutes be thinking differently about activism?
Oh, thank you. These are such great questions. I think it's true that these kinds of values are not emphasized. I think things are shifting. There's more and more attention to the climate emergency, and as it bites deeper, of course, thinking about the ways in which the university has some responsibility to shift things, both in terms of, it's kind of technological production, but also in terms of sort of the imaginary of what we're doing, I think is going to increasingly change. What I've been doing in that regard is thinking about popular planning. As you mentioned, Sarayan, at the outset, I've been working with colleagues to figure out ways in which we can help codify some of the protocols that communities have developed to articulate what they want out of some kind of climate action plan, rather than having a city impose it on those communities. And that usually leads to much more of a kind of intersectional set of demands, right? Not just a kind of green building plan, but rather, some of the kind of complex proposals that I tried to highlight in my presentation. So, kind of codifying some of those things and providing the technical tools which communities can use to perform citizen science, so that they can become the source of cutting edge research and the benchmark for what people in political power feel they should be doing, rather than having to depend on outside experts to make decisions. I think those are some of the really important things which we can, and kinds of alliances which we can strive to cultivate.
Sure. We're coming up to the top of the hour, but there's a couple of great questions still about the question of education. So I'm going to try and squeeze them all together. So from Tammy and David, they're asking, they're two separate questions, so I'm going to be paraphrasing here. What is the role of social institutions in terms of activism and climate justice? I'm thinking of public schools, universities, public libraries, especially when these institutions are under attack by being underfunded, budget cuts and so on. How can they be a site for the kinds of activism that you've been talking about in your talk? And in this, in sort of the same spirit in that regard, David's asking about what's your sense of the contemporary kind of elite white colonial research university as a source of potentially positive political change in Canada and the United States?
Okay.
So civil society institutions and
yeah, great question.
austerity.
I mean, look, if you look into the literature around resiliency in the face of climate change, what it all shows is that social cohesion is absolutely fundamental to being able to make it through both, intense, temporally limited disasters like hurricanes, as well as more sort of attritional forms of slow violence, like, prolonged heat waves, right? So it's those public institutions that the person asked about, like libraries and some public universities as well, that are absolutely fundamental. And so we have to defend them, and we have to make a case that these are important resources to weather the storms that are barreling down on us and under the present set of conditions, and that are only going to intensify. And then in pragmatic terms, they can also be gathering places. And I would suggest sort of nodes for organizing people's planning, right? I mean, you need a physical place to gather on a regular basis to build community cohesion, to put together some kind of process where you decide what you want to do as a community, what you want to see in terms of the changes that are going to make you more resilient. So those places are really important. In terms of the university, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the sort of sense of anger, if not despair, that the questioner asks about. I guess I would just say that universities, like the state itself, we should see them as fairly differentiated. I mean, definitely there's an element of the state which is violent and imperial and is engaged in backing fossil capitalism and breaking the back of water protectors and other resistors of fossil capitalism at the moment. But then, there are also parts of the state, for instance, parts of the municipal administration in New York City that have been won over to some of the policies that I pointed out in my presentation. There are parts of the state where insurgent forces can make some gains and have made some gains in the past. So I think we need to have a kind of strategic analysis and push where it's possible to make changes as much as possible. And we can look at the kinds of strategies used by pink tide movements in Latin America, for instance, where there was a kind of inside-outside strategy, right? Where sort of mass social movements on the outside would ally with parties that had gotten into power and try and develop policies that were transformational. And so I would say the same thing's true of universities. I mean, universities can be horrible elements of kind of colonialism, settler colonialism. I live in New York City, where the two biggest landlords in the city are NYU, New York University, and Columbia, right? And even CUNY, the City University of New York, has a lot of real estate. It's not actively involved in gentrifying and displacing people the way those big private institutions are. And, it's extremely open and extremely affordable. So, I think, again, we need to think about institutions and universities in differentiated ways and, fight to make change in the ones that are, relatively open and responsive to people's struggles in the way that we can.
We're past 7 o'clock by my clock here, kind of thing. There's still a number of great questions that have come in, but I think I'm going to have to ask folks to join me in thanking Ashley for this wonderful talk, and then we'll invite Alison to say a few words about things coming up with the speaker series. But please join me in thanking Ashley for this wonderful presentation, for his thoughts, and for taking these questions. Thanks so much. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you all for tuning in and for your great questions. It's really been such a pleasure and an honor.
Alison, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Sir Ryan, and thank you, Ashley, for a really interesting talk and the amazing questions we got from the audience as well. Thank you so much for being here today, and hopefully see you at upcoming lecture series on sustainability.